Well, it is 10 o'clock and we'd like to welcome you to the November 2022 Farm Office Live. You can see there on the screens, we have a good lineup today. And we're going to start off with some introductions and just some housekeeping. Then we're going to move into a discussion on the 2023 Dairy Margin Coverage Program and move into a legal update and talk about some strategies to keep farmland in the family, and then finish with some federal and state farm program updates and hopefully have some time at the end for some questions and answers. So I'd like to introduce to you our teaching team for today. And we'll have Robert Moore, attorney, OSU, from the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program. Also from the Ag and Resource Law Program, and the director of that program is Peggy Hall. And we have a face back from last month to talk about the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. That's Jason Hartshu, who is fresh 18 days into his new position as a field specialist for dairy management and precision livestock. And then, flipped a little too far there. I'm David Marison, again, fresh into my 18 days as a field specialist in farm management here for OSU Extension. And also behind the scenes in some preparation before we started here, we had Barry Ward from the OSU Income Tax Schools, and Jeff Lewis, who's also working with the OSU Income Tax School. And you'll notice that they will not be with us today because they have a tax school this afternoon. I think the final session of the virtual 4-session OSU Income Tax School, but behind the scenes, they've helped us prepare for today's program. Just as a reminder of what's coming, as I'm looking at snow outside of my window, have to put the woolly bear up there to predict our winter that's coming. But if you like the slides and a recording for today's presentation, as always, you can go to go.osu.edu/farm office live. When you click on that, not only can you download today's slides, you will also have access to any of the programs that we have held in previous months. In fact, you can go all the way back into the 2020 when we started these programs during the coronavirus pandemic to hit some of those programs. So again, if you'd like to see those slides, just go to go.osu.edu/farm office live. As far as questions for today, if you have questions as we move along today's program, we encourage you to drop those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen or there on your toolbar. We will use the chat function for us to drop you out quick links to some of the things that we might be discussing through the program. And again, afterwards, if you have a question and you want to send that to me, I can distribute it to the team. Just send that to me at marison.2@osu.edu. And we'll try to answer as many of those questions as live as we can. If not, we will follow up with you. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Hartshu, who is a field specialist for dairy management and precision livestock. Jason previously served as the county extension educator in Crawford County, and 18 days ago moved into this position. And we have a deadline looming here, Jason. So we thought it was really, really important to have you on today because of this looming deadlines. We turn the calendar into December. So with that, Jason, welcome.
Thanks, David. They definitely do have a deadline looming. It almost feels like, where did the month of November go? When the announcement came out in October of enrollment sign out, it felt like, oh, we got lots of time to get through harvest and work with producers on these decisions and determine what was going to be right for their operation. And next thing we know, it's almost time to turn that calendar over to December and cross that deadline. I'm excited to be here and be part of the Farm Office Live to talk about dairy margin coverage today, and hopefully be back as I continue to work with dairy producers on risk management and different programs they may have some interest in. As we talk about dairy margin coverage, I think it's important to take a minute and look at milk price and where right now futures have it headed. If we think about milk price over the past 6 months, we've seen some close to record prices with some class 1 prices over $24 at the mailbox. But as we look forward, we're seeing both class 3 and class 4 prices declining, and we're also seeing the spread between class 3 and class 4 tightening. Class 3 on here is in red and class 4 is in green. Class 3, of course, is primarily cheese milk, and then class 4 is thought of as primarily butter and non-fat dry milk powders. And we're seeing that class 4 really declining sharply. Right now, November is trading about 23 1/4. expecting it to be down close to 21.25 in January and into February, which is really declining that class 3-4 spread. Class 3 is declining a little bit. It's drove up here in December, which is kind of something we see quite often with cheese price going up around the holidays and then falling off after the holidays. And we're seeing that spread more in that 50-cent range compared to the $4 or $5 that we saw over the past year in that class 3-4 spread. But if you would average those two together, we're looking at right now about a $21 a hundredweight milk price here as we look through 2023. So what does that mean for the margin between our feed cost and our milk price? To think more about that, we ought to take a minute and look at our corn and soybean meal prices and where those futures are projected to go. So pulling December 22 through December of 23, we're seeing corn stay fairly flat right now through about June, July timeframe. When I pulled this slide, we were trading just over 680. We're trading right now in that 670 to 680 area all the way through that June, July timeframe. And then we're seeing corn futures price right now drop off sharply. If we think about that, though, that's really when the most unknowns start factoring into our feed prices as we look towards 23. That's really when markets start trading on what is going on in that 23 crop. How much corn was planted? What were the weather conditions? Did we have planting delays? So there's a lot of unknown out here that could really drive that price on up. It could, of course, drive it down, but there's probably a greater chance that it'll drive it up versus driving it down. And we look at soybean meal. Right now, we do see a decline on soybean meal all the way through 23. Of course, there's a lot of unknowns in that soybean meal price. Soybeans have been trading a little bit higher, which could really drive soybean meal price up. And then just depends on that export market, what happens with soybean meal. But as we look at that, we can have some confidence really probably through June or July when we look at the dairy margin coverage predictor tool that we're going to look at here in a minute as to that prediction of what that price margin is going to be of income over feed cost. So we need to do a short recap and reminder of the dairy margin coverage program as we think about that enrollment. So the original production history for the program was set based on your highest production in 2011, 2012, or 2013. Not many of us are producing the same amount of milk we were almost 10 years ago. So luckily, there is a supplemental coverage that is available to bump you up to 5 million pounds that you could have signed up for the 2022 election. If you didn't do that for 2022, it is possible to still do that for 23. Many producers did lock themselves in. They have to go back in and re-enroll, sign a couple papers with FSA, but they did enroll back in 2019 in 5 years of coverage. So when this farm bill was rolled out in 2019, we were able to enroll in 5 years of coverage that gave us a 25% premium deduction. And many producers took advantage of that, but you still have to remember to go back in and finish the paperwork. There is a $100 administrative fee, plus then the premiums each year. So when we think about those premiums, they're going to be in this table on the right. We'll get to in a minute. In the program, what does it cover? It covers the margin between that national all milk price. It's not truly your milk price, but is a national calculated all milk price. And then the average feed cost for the month from the dairy margin coverage ration. So that ration includes a corn price, a soybean meal price, and then a premium supreme alfalfa price, which is a slight adjustment compared to 2021. 2022 used that premium and supreme alfalfa price. It does offer 2 tiers of coverage. So your first 5 million pounds costs less per hundredweight than the second 5 million pounds. And another important thing to remember is that you may still participate in the other USDA risk management programs, but instead of being, those aren't administered through FSA, they're administered through RMA, who does crop insurance. So that is the Revenue Protection Program and the Livestock Gross Margin Program Dairy. And the big reason why it's really important to remember those, besides that additional risk management, is if you're producing over 5 million pounds, you need to look hard and really consider what level of coverage makes sense in this program. The first 5 million pounds is fairly easy to look through and make this decision. So we have coverage levels from $4 to $9.50. At that $9.50 level, it costs us 15 cents a hundredweight to put a $9.50 income over feed cost margin in there. And that's 15 cents. It seems to me money fairly well spent over the last few years in this program. Now, when we look at tier 2 coverage, the cost of that tier 2 coverage, so milk over 5 million pounds, can get really expensive in a hurry. We see the cost between the two diverges right there at that $5 level. So at $5 a coverage, so if milk price and feed costs, if that margin between the two got to be less than $5, we would have a payout. And that coverage only costs a half a cent. And that's fairly reasonable, although if we get to a $5 margin, things are going to be really tight on the dairy farm, and we may have some operations in duress. But that coverage may be something to consider, or this $4 coverage, which things are really bad, but we have seen a $4 trigger in the last 10 years for that 5 million pounds. But if we look at this $8 level, the first 5 million pounds costs you 10 cents. Anything over that first 5 million pounds would cost $1.81. And we really have to think hard about that coverage and maybe looking at some other risk management tools for that second 5 million pounds, whether that's using revenue protection, livestock gross margin, or if you want to walk away from the subsidized USDA programs altogether, looking at futures and options, or what other programs maybe your company you're shipping milk to offers you. Because if we think about $1.81 for that $8 coverage, it's going to take a pretty good premium payout in order to cover that. And hopefully we don't fall to that level of duress, because we think about that $8, that's going to push us back to about a 620 margin after that, after costs are paid. So we think about 22, things to consider as we're enrolling in this 23 coverage. Did producers enroll in supplemental coverage for that 2022? So that's what allows you, if you had under 5 million pounds of production history, to actually increase that production history up to 5 million pounds. If you didn't enroll in 23, you didn't see the need during that 22 sign up, you can go in and increase that for 2022 using supplemental coverage. And that's going to be based off your 2019 actual milk production history. So if you produced more in 2019 than back in 11, 12, or 13, it's worth looking at the supplemental coverage option. Now, 73% of farms were enrolled in 2022. Not all of those at the 950 margin level, but 73% were enrolled. And for 23, we do keep our updated feed costs. So the updated feed cost is beneficial in that we're using 100% premium alfalfa hay instead of only 50% premium alfalfa hay, which actually increases that ration cost, which makes that margin a little bit narrower and increases the rate of trigger of the program at those higher margin levels. The DMC coverage assessment tool is still available from dmc.dairymarkets.org. That's through the University of Wisconsin. They're contracted with USDA to keep that tool updated and active, and it's available for 23. And that's where the slides are from that we're going to look at here in a minute. It's updated every Thursday, so don't look at it every day. But if you want to watch how the markets are changing, check it on, say, Friday, or pick a day of the week and check that to see how markets have changed and how it's affecting that dairy margin coverage predicted margin. And the date here that we mentioned that was looming is December 9th. So everybody, enrollment ends on December 9th, and that's going to be through your local FSA service center. If they haven't called you yet, pick up the phone, give them a call, and schedule your appointment to sign up. So when we look at performance here back in 22, there have been margin payouts. We feel like 22 has been a pretty good year. When we look at milk price over here, the all milk price in January, $24.20. Peaked right here in May at $27.30. That's a really felt like a really good milk price. Had a feed cost of $14.76 per hundredweight, leaving us a margin of $12.54. There was some profitability to be made. But it didn't take long as milk price started sliding, and feed costs have actually continued to climb as we got close to harvest. Now with harvest prices, we've seen feed costs come down a little bit, but we had some margin payouts. So in August, the dairy margin was $8.08. So there was a payout at that 950 level or 850 level from the dairy margin coverage program. And there was a payout here in October. October's margin was $8.62. And then when we look, or that was September, sorry about that. And then October is still projected, November and December are all projected. Right now, there's not a projected October payout, but we're looking at a 2 cent. Wouldn't take much for that change here as we go through October for that payout to get triggered. And then when we look at November and December, there's a predicted payout at that 850 level, or 950 level for both November and December. So if producers enrolled in 22 at that 950 level, they actually have had their premium covered. So since we're talking about enrollment here for 23, what is that margin forecast? What are we looking at for payouts as we go forward into 23? What does that dairy profitability look like that can kind of be determined by this dairy margin coverage forecast? We're looking at this declining milk price, looking at all milk price in December, about 22.13, sliding through all the way to July, where we're gonna hopefully hit a bottom at about 21.52 and then start to come back up. Corn prices, soybean price, soybean meal price are all staying up. Sliding some as that previous graph showed throughout the year, but of course, when we get to that later part of the year, there's a lot of uncertainty. But that margin forecast right now for January has us at a 756 margin and 759 in February. As we look down through at that 950 level, there's right now is a predicted payout for all of 2023 with a year average of $8.12. Hopefully that doesn't happen. We always like it when our profits come from the milk check. But if this holds true, there's definitely some ability for the dairy margin coverage program to benefit your operation and help you cover your cost. So when we talk about covering costs, so if you produced 5 million pounds at 95% coverage, which is maximum coverage, that would cover 4,750,000 pounds. The total premium cost to be $7,125. That total premium cost would actually be covered right now with the predicted January payout. That predicted payout for January is about $7,600, and then another $7,500 in February. So even if prices improve a little bit or feed costs go down, there's a pretty good chance that your total premium will be covered by the program by the first 2 months of 2023, which really makes that return on investment a fairly sound decision to go ahead and participate in this program. Now, as we look, as feed costs decline, milk price stays fairly steady. The payouts get less per month as we get later in the year, but we have to see, with all the unknowns as we go forward. Are there any I guess David said we'll do questions at the end, which I'll jump off, but thanks everybody. And we'll keep you updated on dairy programs as we move forward.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. So if they have questions later, I know you're getting to another meeting, but if they have questions, you can just drop you a line there at your email, hartshoe.11@osu.edu. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm up next. Hello, everybody. And I'm trying to turn my video on. For some reason, it won't do that, but I apologize. I apologize for that. And thank you, Jason, so much for joining us. It's really nice to have you jumping in there and filling Diane's shoes, which are, as we all know, pretty big shoes to try to fill, but you've done a great job. So we're very excited to have you with us. And here we go. So my video is finally going. There we go. So good morning, everybody. It's time now to move from dairy margin coverage to legal issues. And I thought this morning that I would try to cover legislation for you, but I have to tell you, legislation's in a bit of a mess right now as we are working through the lame duck session. And it's a little bit hard to report on how that's all going to flush out. And rather than spend your time trying to think about what might happen, I'll hold that off until December, and we might have a better idea at that point what legislation will actually go through. As I've reminded you in the past, we're in the second of our 2-year session before the Ohio General Assembly. And so anything that I've talked about for the last 2 years that is not passed by the end of this year will die its official death and then we'll start all over in January with a new legislative session. So just been waiting and watching to see what will happen with some of that legislation that's still lurking there in the General Assembly. And it doesn't seem as though there will be much coming out of our ag committees at this point. They just have a little bit left. So that's my legislative update. So what I chose to speak about instead this morning, as you see the building there that houses our Ohio Supreme Court, is a couple of cases that have come out recently that are certainly very important for agriculture. And the first is, sorry, my screen keeps moving on me. The first is the consent decree that was just issued in the Lake Erie lawsuit, one of many lawsuits that have been in process against some of the nutrient issues in Lake Erie. And this one was one that was filed back in 2019 by the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Excuse me. And at the same time, the Lucas County Board of Commissioners also filed a lawsuit against the EPA. And this is the US EPA that we're talking about here. They joined those two cases together in the case that you see here now in front of you. And in that case, the claim was that the US EPA should have challenged Ohio EPA for its refusal to designate the Western Lake Erie Basin as an impaired water. And that's a significant action because once that designation is made, then it kicks in a requirement to do a TMDL, a total maximum daily load plan for that waterway. And the failure to designate that water as impaired, even though Michigan had designated its portion of the Lake Erie waters as impaired, was something that concerned many, including the Environmental Law and Policy Center, the Lucas County Board of Commissioners. But despite that concern, the US EPA approved and didn't make Ohio EPA reconsider or do anything more with that decision. So later, and this is kind of a long story, I apologize if you're not familiar with it and it sounds a little clunky, but it is a bit of a disjointed story. But later in 2020, Ohio did then designate the Western Lake Erie Basin as impaired. And then that kicked in a requirement to develop the TMDL, but we still now here toward the end of 2022 do not have the TMDL requirements for the Western Lake Erie Basin. So the case is still ongoing and they're still insisting that the US EPA basically force the Ohio EPA to take this issue to heart and create and complete a TMDL plan. Now, what that TMDL plan will do is establish maximum daily loads for a number of pollutants in that waterway. And of course, that could affect agriculture by way of establishing daily loads for nitrogen and phosphorus and similar types of materials, that the maximum amount that could be in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So many of the environmental interests think that that's a much more effective approach than the voluntary approach that Ohio has taken, especially through our H2O program that encourages voluntary actions. They're pressing for mandatory actions that would come in and bring those amounts down in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So where we are now with that case is that there is now a consent decree, which is basically a proposed agreement, settlement agreement between those parties. And they have issued that decree. And there is a comment period open. The public may comment on whether or not to approve this consent decree. And I've given you the link there if you're interested in commenting on the federal government website for the case. What the consent decree does is says, okay, Ohio EPA, here is your schedule. This is a binding schedule for completing that TMDL. And as you can see here, it's by the end of this year. So it's saying you need to wrap this up now by the end of 2022 with a draft. And then by June of 2023 with that final TMDL, and that will of course go through public comment period and become finalized by that time, June 30th of 2023. If they fail to meet that deadline, then the consent decree says the US EPA will step in and has to complete that TMDL for the Western Lake Erie Basin within 6 months of that date of failure. So that's where that case stands. It looks like we will definitely be seeing a TMDL then for the Western Lake Erie Basin. And now it's just a question of when. Will we see the draft by the end of December? Or if that doesn't occur, will the US EPA step in and propose a draft TMDL for Lake Erie for the Western Basin? So also, the courts have been pretty active. We had a case that came out of the Ohio Supreme Court recently on eminent domain. This one has been brewing for quite some time as well, and started a number of years ago when landowners up in Mahoning County objected to Mill Creek Metro Parks use of eminent domain to establish a bike path through many of their farms and other residential lands. And so as that process was playing out, several of them refused to voluntarily sell their land and ended up in eminent domain proceedings against the park. And at the same time, landowners were trying to get legislation passed that would remove a park district's ability to use eminent domain for this type of recreational trail or bike path. That was not completely successful, but what was successful was what I would kind of characterize as a sneaky little provision that was inserted into the budget bill that was passed in 2021. And that provision said, a park district in any county that has a population between 220 and 240,000 residents cannot use eminent domain to establish a recreational trail for the next 5 years. And so that was a sneaky way to really target Mahoning County, which, as you can guess, fell between that population range, and to say you can't use eminent domain for the next 5 years to establish a recreational trail or a bike path. So when that provision became effective, one of the landowners then, who was in the midst of an eminent domain case, tried to use that and pick it up and say, hey, you can't do this. And the county said, no, that's not effective. And they were starting to proceed with that eminent domain case at the county level. The landowner asked the Supreme Court to step in and issue what's called a writ of prohibition that would stop them from hearing that case at the county level. But the Supreme Court issued its decision a few weeks ago and said, no, we're not going to stop this because, first of all, the law wasn't in effect when your case began. And so we can't give it that retroactive effect. But second, you just need to get through this, and your right is to appeal the case once the county does make a decision on it. You still have that right, and that's what we're going to go with. So that case will now proceed in Mahoning County. At the same time, the Supreme Court decided to hear another Mahoning County case with the same bike trail, and that's one that was challenged and went to an appellate court decision. And that appellate court said, we don't even think the park district can use its authority that is stated in Ohio law, its ability to use eminent domain. We don't think it can use it for this purpose. And that was the decision of the appellate court. The park district appealed that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will now hear that case. So we have a lot going on this issue of whether the use of eminent domain by a park district for a bike trail is a proper and legitimate use of that legal authority. So I'll keep you posted on that. The other big news that we had in not necessarily a court case, but a quasi-judicial decision by the Ohio Power Siting Board was the first large-scale solar project to be denied in Ohio. Now, we don't have many actual projects up and running. We have 2 that are in operation, but quite a few coming after that that have been approved. And now we have the first one that was not approved. It was denied by the Ohio Power Siting Board. And this is the Birch Solar One project that crosses over from Allen to Auglaize County, a pretty significant project, as you can see by the numbers there. A total of 2,345 acres for the construction and site, and then that will shrink down to that 1,410 acres of solar panels that were proposed for that area in those 2 counties. Both of the counties objected and did not support this project. Now, this project came in after our new law in Senate Bill 52 that I've talked with you about before. That law gives some county ability to reject or restrict areas in the county from solar or wind development. But this proposal, the Birch Solar One project, was grandfathered in and was not subject to those new laws. But both of those counties have since then, under those new laws, established restricted areas, either the entire area or parts of the county that the county commissioners have designated as restricted from solar and or wind development in their counties. So in the midst of all that is the Birch Solar One project that couldn't be subject to those restrictions. And so the counties made it clear that they opposed the project, as well as the 4 townships that would be affected by this project. And it was that uniform and consistent public opposition, that was the language that the Power Siting Board used in its decision, that swayed the Power Siting Board to reject the project. I think this is significant because we do have many communities where there is pretty strong public opposition to the project. And here is the Power Siting Board saying, well, we have to consider that. It's our legal duty to consider that under one of the requirements that it must examine when it reviews a project. It must determine that that project is necessary to the public, a matter of public convenience and necessity. And in the end, the Power Siting Board said, no, the public opposes it. The public that has to live in and around this project opposes it for many different factors. And you can see those that I've cited here for this, the potential impact on land use and property values and drinking water quality and drainage and many concerns that were raised at the local level, and the Power Siting Board took those to heart and said, we can't approve this project. So we're in the midst now of a 30-day appeal period. That decision was issued October 20th. So the appeal period will be ending soon, and we'll see if that developer will appeal that denial of its certificate, because that denial means the project dies. It is done and it can't move forward. Also, just in regard to solar development in Ohio, as I said, we only have a few solar farms that are, or solar developments, I guess I should call them, that are up and running. And you can see here the map of the current status of solar development in Ohio. And it is the squares that you see there. So they're orange and they're blue, and those are the ones that are still in the process of being constructed. They've either begun construction or they've been approved and are awaiting that start date for their construction. And as you can see, there are quite a few here that are in that construction phase. And so the FSA office here in Ohio issued a statement to landowners saying, hey, if you're going to have land converting from ag to solar panels, you need to report those acres, because that is going to affect your base acre calculation and for purposes of the FSA programs. So that is now something that those landowners who have leased that land and then the construction is about to begin and that land won't be going into production, ag production, need to report those acres to FSA. And those are certainly going to change your calculations. Okay, and the last issue I want to talk about here, I want to bring Robert in on this. Robert and I have been talking about, it's that time of year, harvest is wrapping up, payments are being made, we're thinking about next year. So it's a good time to review farmland leasing situations. And so we have a few thoughts we want to share on that as we think about going into the next year of a leasing arrangement. A first important consideration is if you have a written lease, what does it say about renewal? Sometimes we forget to go back and look to that document and see what it says, see what the term is, see when it does renew and how it renews, or whether there's a termination that might kick in. So looking at those two kind of in tandem, what are the renewal terms and what are the termination provisions? If we're in a verbal leasing situation, of course, that's harder to know. Does it automatically renew into another period? Well, there have been a lot of cases in Ohio on that very issue when we're talking about verbal farmland leases. And typically, we look at what's the mode of behavior between these parties. What has it been? Does it just, do we just make that payment in November and flip over into the next year? I think it's typical that that's the mode of practice. I think Robert probably saw that a lot in private practice as well, that the parties just allowed that verbal leasing situation to continue until somebody does something to stop it or terminate it. But it's important to consider what is our situation here. Can we renew? Can one party terminate? But I have to remind you that we now have the new law in Ohio that said, if you didn't terminate by September 1st, provide a written notice of termination as the landowner, then that verbal tenant can assume that the lease is going to kick over into another lease period. So a couple of important considerations there to make in regards to renewal or termination. Robert, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Good. Okay. So then if we do have a written lease, obviously, or even in a verbal lease situation, another question that we often encounter at this point in time is, well, can we review the lease terms? And certainly the lease rate is one that we might want to consider and review, but some other provisions that can come up. And I know, Robert, you've been talking about some situations, some farmers that are wanting to do tiling and make some capital improvements like that. So let's talk a little bit about how that could happen in a leasing situation. Some leases do say we will revisit the lease rate every year. I don't know how common that was for you, Robert, to write that into your lease, reviewing it every year, annually.
Yeah, if it was, a year-to-year lease, then there would not be the need to incorporate, reviewing the lease terms. But once you get a lease, maybe 3, 4, 5 years in length, then I think there needs to be a provision in there to review the lease term, lease rate, and because we're just so volatile right now with land prices, rental prices, that if there's not a way to review the lease rate in just a few years, the lease rate could be unfair, whether too high or too low. And the other issue on capital improvements where we see this is maybe the tenant would like to put tile in because the farm needs better drainage, but the landowner may not want to, pay $1,000 an acre to put it in. So that's where sometimes we'll do a long-term lease, maybe a 10, 15, 20-year lease that says, okay, the tenant will pay for the tile in exchange for a long-term lease. And then that's where we would definitely want a provision in there that maybe every 2-3 years, they review the lease rate. If they can't agree, maybe it's county average, maybe we get an appraiser, some way to update the rate to make sure it's fair to everybody.
Good, excellent. So if we're just looking at a year-to-year lease, verbal, it is pretty common to at least have a conversation about what that lease rate will be for next year. If we're entering into a new written year-to-year lease, of course, we would negotiate, but if we've got a multi-year lease, we need to go back and look at what those provisions are for negotiating some of these new terms that we might need to add. And it's common to be able to amend a lease, if you do have a written lease, to amend it with something, as Robert suggested, to, address capital improvements or to enter into a new longer term lease. So Robert, what are you thinking about early termination? Because I'm looking at all these solar farms, shouldn't call them solar farms, solar developments that are going on to farmland. And so we know that many of those lands would be leased out, and they're going to perhaps lose their lease at some point whenever that construction begins. It's typical in a solar lease to say, we have the right to move in and start construction whenever we're ready. So what do we do in those situations where there might be an early termination by the landowner because of that or some other type of change?
Yeah, so I think it's always good to include in a lease what happens if there is an early termination, because it's possible, the landowner receives an offer for $1,500 an acre for solar. They're being paid $150, $200 an acre for, just cash lease. And, the economics are pretty easy to figure there, that it'd probably be worthwhile to terminate the lease early and pay the tenant whatever damages or lost profits they're owed. So typically, to address that in a lease, we'd put in, if the lease is terminated early, other than for the tenant's own termination of it, then the tenant is owed lost profits, and maybe we establish that, or maybe it's calculated. And then also the tenant is owed any fertilizer, any tillage work they've done in anticipation of the next crop. So the more we can specify what happens on an early termination, the less likely we are to have the tenant and landlord end up in court in a lawsuit. So and that would go the same maybe if you have a farm that's close to development pressure. Anything that you might think, well, at some point the tenant or the landlord could say, I got a better deal elsewhere, I'll just terminate the lease. Specifically in those situations, we ought to have what happens if the lease is terminated early.
And it is common in many of these solar leases that the landowner has negotiated provisions with that solar developer to cover the costs of a lost crop if the construction begins in the midst of that crop cycle. So there hopefully will be that assurance there that those monies are going to also be available to reimburse the operator for those lost costs. That would be our hope, that that's how those situations would play out. Also, we like to remind folks that with that written lease, Ohio law allows you to file a short form of that lease, and it's called a memorandum of lease, and to record that in the county recorder's office. And that's a step that really protects the tenant operator from a situation where the land changes hands. We just had a question this week about that. If that lease is written and recorded with the county recorder, then that new purchaser is deemed to have notice of that leasing arrangement, and that can make that lease binding then on that new purchaser. So that's a very important step for a tenant operator to have that short form memorandum of lease prepared. You don't have to reveal the leasing rate. We have a law bulletin on Farm Office that explains that step, as well as a number of other farm leasing resources, what to include in a lease, and a couple of other law bulletins. So you can find all of those on farmoffice.osu.edu. Robert, anything else you want to say about leasing?
Nope, I think that covers it pretty well.
Okay. And then just speaking of our resources on Farm Office, we have just recently put a few new publications out on Farm Office. I'm really excited about these We have the law bulletin on the beginning income tax credits that we've talked about many times here on Farm Office Live. So that's available, explaining what we know about that program that is currently under development at ODA. They are trying to finish up the details on that program and have it up and running January 1st so that those income tax credits will be available starting in 2023. But we do have that bulletin. And then we also have a couple of other publications that Robert has spent a lot of time on lately. I'm so glad that I have him here in the program and the grant funding to have him here with us creating these publications, because we have 2 new publications. The first is Keeping Farmland in the Family, which he will be talking about here in a moment. And second is his long-term care guide that addresses those long-term care needs and risks and strategies that farmers can use to deal with that potential risk of long-term care and its impact on the farm. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Robert, now to go back to the Keeping Farmland in the Family publication and what you want to share today on that.
Right,
Are you okay with your screen share? There
Yep.
you go.
I'll get there. All right, there we go. So, yeah, what we're going to be talking about today is really the second half of the Keeping Farmland in the Family publication. So if you were on with us last time, you may remember I discussed the risk to farmland. And what we talked about was these 6 different risks. Now, these aren't an exhaustive list. There are others, obviously, but these are probably the biggest risk for farmland leaving the family for most families in Ohio. So just quickly, I'll kind of review these risks. Partition. Partition is where multiple people own land together. And Ohio law allows anyone who has their name on the deed to force a sale of the land. And we see that, often. It is a real thing. And usually we see it where maybe, a few siblings inherit land together. One of the siblings wants to cash out and get the money from the land, and that sibling forces the sale of the land through partition. Divorce, obviously, jointly owned assets that are earned during the marriage are subject to divorce and typically would be split evenly in most cases. Death, we probably all know of a situation where somebody died, did not have an estate plan, or the estate plan was not very good, and land either went to somebody who was going to sell it or went to multiple people, and we got into a partition issue. Long-term care costs, medical costs, kind of the same issue there. We just never know what kind of long-term care costs we may incur and or medical cost. And a long-term care facility or the health provider always has the option, if they're owed money, to foreclose on the farmland to get paid. And then poor estate planning. There's many tools that we have in our legal toolbox to put a plan together to address just about any issue you can come up with. We've probably got a tool. So poor estate planning often leads to land leaving the family through partition, or maybe land went to an heir that just simply sold it as soon as possible. So those are the risks that we talked about last time. So like I said, this time we're going to talk about what strategies do we have available to keep farmland in the family. So as I look at these strategies, I think about it in kind of a continuum from really no restrictions on the left side all the way to using trust that absolutely will not allow the sale of the land. And so I'll talk about each of these different tools along the spectrum. one at a time. And so let's start on the left-hand side, which is the transfer to heirs with no restrictions or limits. This is not very common, at least in my experience. It's not common for a farm family, mom and dad to say, we don't care what happens with the land. We'll just give it to the kids, whatever they do with it, it's up to them. That is not very common. Happens, but it's not very common. So with no restrictions, we are leaving it totally up to the heirs or beneficiaries of the land as to how they want to manage and own that land. And again, we go back to partition. If land goes to multiple individuals with no restrictions and their name just is on the deed with the other owners, they can force the sale of that land anytime they want to. So certainly no restrictions is the most risky strategy, but it's also the easiest because you don't have to do anything. So again, the advantages, no planning needed, no cost incurred, but the disadvantages is we have no protection on the farmland. All right, the next tool we have is conservation and ag easements. And this tool isn't so much about keeping the land in the family as it is keeping the land in farmland or open space. So a conservation easement, if you're not familiar with it, is where the landowner gifts or sells the development rights in the land to a government entity, to a land trust, some organization that is willing to hold that easement and occasionally inspect the land to make sure it's not being developed and enforce the easement as well. And people will ask me about conservation easements and they'll say, well, are they really permanent? They really are. I mean, there are ways they could be undone if the entity holding them just simply can't enforce the easement anymore. But you should assume that a conservation easement will be permanent because odds are it will be permanent. You won't be able to get out of it. So even though you give or sell your development rights away, the land is still freely transferable. So if you own land and you've given the development rights away, you can sell that farm to me or anyone. The easement rights still go with the land, as in the person you sell or transfer the land to cannot develop the land. The conservation easement runs with the land. So some advantages and disadvantage of this is the advantage, it will ensure that the land stays in farmland or open space and not developed. When you transfer the easement rights to the entity that holds them, at a minimum, it will be a charitable deduction that you can take to offset some income tax. And if you're lucky enough to find an entity that will buy your development rights, you actually can sell those and get income and or a tax deduction. Disadvantages, the easement is permanent. Again, if you're going to do one of these easements, you should assume it will always be in an easement because that is the most likely scenario. It does reduce the value of the land. Part of a land's value is the potential to develop it into residential or commercial property. So it does reduce the value of the land. And again, it doesn't eliminate the risk of leaving the family because it can be sold. It just eliminates the risk that the land can be developed into houses or industry. So the next strategy we look at is rights of first refusal. And what a right of first refusal is it's an agreement where the landowner signs a contract with another person that says, if I want to sell my land or transfer my land, I will give you the first option to buy my land. And it is a contract, it should be recorded. And the different terms that should be in the right of first refusal, first of all, is how to determine price. Should it be done through an appraisal? Should there be a 3 appraisal process? Is it matching an offer from someone else? Sometimes you'll see deeds that goes from one person to another, and it'll just say, we give the seller right of first refusal to buy the property back, and that's all it says. Something like that, you're just asking for a lawsuit because it doesn't tell you how the right of first refusal will work. So I think the right of first refusal should have detailed terms in it. Again, how to determine price, probably number 1. Is there any discount on the price or a number of years to pay? So it could be, and we see this sometimes where maybe mom and dad will give son or daughter, a few acres or a farm to build a house on, and then they'll, in exchange, get a right of first refusal and right of first refusal back. And maybe it'll say they only have to pay 75 cents on the dollar. Maybe they have 10 years to pay for it. You can put whatever term you want into the right of first refusal. Then what transfers a right of first refusal is also important, and that is, can you transfer the land to your spouse without triggering the right of first refusal? Can you transfer it to children or grandchildren without triggering the right of first refusal? We'll often use right of first refusals to keep land from leaving the family, but as long as it's kept in the family, it can be transferred to descendants or other family members. And then lastly, how long does the right of first refusal last? If the right of first refusal says it's binding on all heirs and successors, that technically means it's going to last forever, many generations. And so it could be that 50 years from now, somebody is having to track down, 20 or 30 heirs all over the country, all over the world, to get them to release their right of first refusal rights. So we tend to want to make the right of first refusal last maybe one generation or a person's life, or maybe a number of years. So advantages to the right of first refusal, again, ensures that other family members will have the first chance to buy it before it leaves the family, and we can add favorable purchase terms to give incentive to other family members to buy it out. Disadvantage is if the family members don't want to exercise their right of first refusal rights, then it can leave the family. Also, a right of first refusal will sometimes make the land less marketable, because a buyer may say, well, I don't want to spend all my time negotiating to buy this land just to have someone else meet my offer and buy it. So before you put a right of first refusal on the land, you should realize that it can cause some potential owners to lose interest in the property. All right, next strategy, long-term leases. So this is typically used when we want off-farm heirs to own land, but we want to protect the land base of the farming heir. So maybe we'll say, okay, the Smith farm goes to this child, but as a condition of receiving the Smith farm, the farming heir has a 10 or 20-year lease on that property. And that's typically something we do through a trust. So the land at death, the land would go into the trust. The trustee would execute a long-term lease with the beneficiary and then distribute that land to the beneficiary with the long-term lease. What this does is it allows the non-farm heir to receive income from the land, but it does help to a large degree of certainty that that land will be available to the farming heir. Leases can be up to 99 years long, but I typically like to make them somewhere that'll help protect the farming heir's, farm career. So if somebody's 50 years old, maybe we'll put a 20-year lease on it to cover their farming career, but it can be any length you want to. Now, one thing to keep in mind is a long-term lease makes the land, if not completely unmarketable, to a large degree unmarketable. Because if there's a 20-year lease on it, who's going to buy it, other than the sibling who is farming it? So a long-term lease definitely reduces the marketability of the property, and the lease can survive death by adding language in there that it's binding on successor owners. So the advantages of using long-term leases to keep the land in the family, protects the land base for the farming heir, allows ownership for non-farm heirs, because sometimes we're worried, hey, if I give this farm to the non-farm heir, they'll just sell it, and the farming heir needs to have it to farm. So this is one way we can get around that dilemma. And it's relatively easy to establish. Lease doesn't have to be real complicated to be effective. Disadvantages: it makes the land mostly unmarketable. Now, you could say this is an advantage, because if you're using a long-term lease, you're trying to keep the land in the family. So that make the land mostly unmarketable could be an advantage and a disadvantage, depending on whether you're the owner or the tenant. Restricts the control of the new owner. So while somebody owns land with a long-term lease on it, there's little they can do with it. So we always want to make sure when we're doing farm succession that we tend to sometimes look too much from the farming heir's perspective. We do need to look at it from the non-farm heir's perspective to see, is this fair? Will this work? And like we talked about before, if it's a long-term lease, we really need a mechanism in there to occasionally update the lease rate to make sure that it doesn't become unfair, being too high or too low for one of the parties. LLCs. So I know I've said this before, and I probably said it many times. In farm succession planning, LLCs are more valuable to hold land than they are for liability protection or whatever else we might use them for. So the concept here is, if you have multiple family members that are going to be owning farmland, to get away from that partition issue where any owner can force the sale of the land, we'll put the land in an LLC. Then the LLC is inherited by the multiple heirs. And what the LLC does is it takes away partition rights, because partition rights only apply when you have your name on the deed, when you own actual real estate. By putting the land in an LLC, you don't own the land, you own an interest in the LLC, and the LLC owns the land. That takes away partition rights. So with the LLC, we can include terms in the operating agreement that may say you've got to have a majority of owners agree to sell the land, or maybe it's a super majority. You got to have 3/4 of the owners to sell land. And sometimes we'll make it unanimous. Let's say every owner of this LLC has to agree before land is sold. So a well-designed LLC can make it difficult, if not nearly impossible, for land to leave the family. Because even if somebody did try to sell their ownership outside of the family, the other family members would get to buy it back at a discount over a number of years. And even if it did go to somebody outside of the LLC, they have no voting or management rights, would not be entitled to any distributions. So being an owner of an LLC, of a family held LLC, and you're not a family member is not something you want, because it could be nearly have no value as an asset because you don't have any control and you may not get any income distributions. So the advantages of the LLCs, again, allows multiple family members to own land. Should be land instead of LLC. So anytime we're looking at a succession plan, where we're going to have multiple family members own land, we ought to take a long, hard look at LLCs to see if they can help prevent partition. Land can only leave the family upon affirmative action of the family. Again, maybe that's majority, maybe it's 2/3, maybe it's unanimous. And the LLC can go on for many generations into the future. Disadvantages: sometimes if we're not careful, we may put people into business together that should not be in business together. If we've got siblings that just, can't get along and just, fight over everything, we probably shouldn't put them in an LLC together. Maybe we should use a long-term lease, or right of first refusal, or a trust instead. There is some cost to establishing an LLC and transferring land. Maybe that's a few $1,000s. The land LLC will need another bank account, will need another tax return. So there is some management to do. And the land in the LLC may not be as available as collateral, because unless all the owners agree to put a mortgage on the land, a bank may not want to put a mortgage on the land. The last strategy are trust. So what this concept is the landowner sets up a trust, and then at the landowner's death, the land goes into the trust. And the trust provisions say this land cannot be sold for a number of years, or until this generation passes away. So let's say we've got somebody who owns farmland, and they say, I'm worried my children will just sell the farmland when they get it. I want my grandchildren to inherit it. I want my grandchildren to enjoy the benefits of it. So what we may do in that situation is put it in a trust. And the trust would say, this land cannot be sold while any of the children are living. Children can get the income from it, but the children can't sell it. They don't own it. And then at the children's death, then it goes out to the grandchildren, and then the grandchildren can do whatever they want, or whatever terms may be in the trust. But we use trust when the person says, I want to make 100% sure that this land will not be sold. Then we're probably going to a trust, because all the other strategies we have used might make it more difficult for the land to leave the family, but it doesn't prevent, in all cases, leaving the family. The trust is the one tool we have that can pretty well guarantee that land will not leave the family until the terms are met that you have established, whether, again, that's a number of years or upon the death of a certain group of beneficiaries. Can also be used for heirs that have tax problems. So if you got an heir that maybe you're thinking, if they get any inheritance, it's just going to be wasted, or there's creditors kind of in line to get it, you can use this same process where the beneficiary doesn't own the land, the trust does. So advantages of the trust, it's on that spectrum, it's the furthest to the right. It keeps the tightest control over the land. It can provide income to beneficiaries without those beneficiaries actually owning the land. Can be used for multiple purposes, not just for somebody who's going to want to cash out, but maybe somebody with special needs. Again, somebody who's not good at managing assets or money. And then the disadvantages: cost to set up. Again, it's going to be several $1,000s to do that probably. Beneficiaries have no control over the land. Again, this could also be an advantage. And the land may not be available as collateral for the beneficiaries. It is possible to give them the ability to mortgage the land, but we got to be careful how we do that and when we do that, but it is possible. So again, if we just kind of summarize, partition, a good way to eliminate the partition risk is an LLC or trust. Divorce, easement, leases, and LLCs can be a good way to do that. Death, any of the tools I mentioned can help keep land from leaving the family at death. Long-term care, probably more easements, LLCs, trust. Medical costs, again, same easement, LLCs, and trust. And poor estate planning, any of the tools I mentioned is better than not having an estate plan or a poor estate plan. So looks like my time is up. So we'll go ahead and pass it along.
All right. Thanks, Robert. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, it's good.
Great legal updates, Peggy and Robert. Really, really nice job. And on the LLC that Robert was talking about, we had a question come up this past week of how can I convert an existing LLC to include some of my farm activity? And he wrote a really nice article that was posted yesterday. So in our remaining time, I'd like to bounce into the federal and state farm program updates, some updates here from Ohio, remind a few things that have happened since our last farm office live. So we'll jump right into it. Mentioned this last time. In fact, we had Bruce and Eric along myself on last month's farm office live to share that the news that the Ohio State University had hired 3 field specialists for farm management. So Bruce and Eric and myself are pleased to be stepping in those roles here just a couple weeks ago. As far as some farm management news on the statewide, Peggy mentioned about the beginner farmer tax credit, and we've been talking about the farmer tax credit for quite a few of these farm office live programs. And just to give you an update on our side, ODA has asked for requests, and those were due on November 14th for requests from providers who would provide the farm financial management education for the newer beginner farmers to go through. And we put a proposal in on behalf of the university for 3 different iterations of training so that students and beginner farmers could get that training at a place and at a time that best meets them. So we have a virtual option that will be created. We also have an in-person option for that 10-hour course, which is the minimum requirements, as well as one of our classes on campus that we hopefully will be approved for those beginner farm tax credit programs. Also, Bruce has led our effort for the Ohio Ag Lenders Seminar. We had 4 locations this year, reached over 140 ag lenders. I really appreciate our ag lenders for attending those Ohio Ag Lenders seminars each year. For those of that you were on the call, our Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Development Economics had their Outlook meeting here on this past Tuesday, but Extension will be offering our version of Outlook meetings as we move forward into the winter programming season. We're pleased that Mike Estat is leading that effort again this year, and those programs are going to be held in Clinton, Darke, Defiance, a Madison Champaign group, Muskingum, Pickaway Ross group, as well as Wayne County. So I would just say, just keep looking on Farm Office Live as far as some of the details for those programs as they get finalized for January, February, and March. As far as the Farm Financial Management and Policy Institute, last month we gave an update about the unveiling of the Institute, and the Institute's a new thing. Actually, it's really not new because it was funded decades ago in the legislature. It was developed, but finally funded, and we really appreciate the legislature for funding the Institute. So this will be the unified center to where we can work in farm management and ag policy across the state and just increase the work that we are doing in this area. On November 4th, I was named the interim director for the Institute. So I'm pleased to be stepping in that role and help to shape the Institute as we go forward. Appreciate the work that John Foltz has been doing here over the last year to help put some of the parameters, the operating procedures and parameters behind the Institute. So you'll be hearing more about that, including more about it, about affiliated faculty and staff of that institute. So be watching for that as we go into future Farm Office Lives. The OSU Income Tax School, and you don't see Barry here mention that, Barry and Jeff, because they are out busy teaching these Ohio income tax preparer schools across Ohio. 2-day schools have already been held in Fremont, Dayton, Lima, Zanesville, as well as of a 4-day virtual school, which is concluding this afternoon. We do have a couple remaining schools in Ashland and Hartville that are still available for registration. I do know that the Columbus site is sold out, but if we have some tax professionals that are attending today's session that haven't been able to schedule one of those, you can go to farmoffice.osu.edu/tax. Some really good information in this year's workbook that the trainers are offering. And then we held the farmer and farmland owner income tax webinar last evening. And we had a few technical difficulties. When I say we, me, had some technical difficulties, but we had a real nice response to farmers and landowners from across Ohio as well as Indiana that were on that program last night. And for tax professionals, you might want to put on your schedule the Ag Tax Issues webinar, which is scheduled for December 13th. And again, that's an intensive all-day training that includes some continuing education credits. And again, you can go to farmoffice.osu.edu, and that /tax will take you right to that. So you will see the details about that program. Again, all day, all about agriculture taxes. This was announcements hot off the press because this was announced yesterday. I'm glad I saw it come through on my email so we could share it here today. A couple of things that you will see, and again, all these farmers.gov, you can find out details from the Farm Service Agency, but 2 new programs. Really, one's in addition to an existing program. The other one is a brand new stand-up program, but the ERP and the PARP, again, we love our acronyms, right? Emergency Relief Program Phase 2. So Phase 1 is underway. In fact, the sign up is ending here for Phase 1, but the eligible crop losses. So these are tied to revenue. So comparing revenue between years. So any crop losses that measured through revenue losses in 2020 and 2021. So a variety of losses that could occur because of wildfires, hurricanes, floods. We've had some derechos, excessive heat, winter storms, freezes, including those polar vortexes, or excessive moisture or drought. So this is Phase 2. So they have made some simplifications. They have promised some simplifications in the paperwork as it goes through the FSA here in Phase 2. In Phase 1, there was $10 billion worth of assistance that was put out for this emergency relief program. 7.1 billion has already been paid for eligible crop losses. And those are for crops that are under federal crop insurance or the NAP program. I'm going to mention NAP here in a few minutes. So the Phase 2 program details will be coming out of that. So if you have some of those losses and you weren't part of that Phase 1, you can get in and go through maybe more a simplified program. But do note that the Phase 1 for the ERP actually is still open. So there's time if you want to get in under the Phase 1 of this program. That sign up ends on December 16th. So if you have some of your stuff in order and want to get that taken care of, you can go visit with your Farm Service Agency offices through December 16th. That's the sign up deadline. And then details about Phase 2 and the sign up and the procedures is forthcoming, as this was just announced yesterday that they're extending a Phase 2 program. And then the second program, which is a new program, we thought we were done with the pandemic relief programs, but yeah, here's another one. Pandemic Assistance Revenue Program, so the PARP. So this is for eligible crop losses, again, measured through revenue. So they're comparing the revenue. Again, most of our Schedule Fs are already prepared for these years. So this is what they're looking at, the Schedule Fs. So you're looking at the revenue between 2020 in comparison to 2018 and 2019. So they understand, the government understands there might have been some gaps in some of the previous programs. So they've stood up this new program, this Pandemic Assistance Revenue Program. Again, details are forthcoming on this. We don't know much. It was just released yesterday, but as we go forward here, hopefully by our December program, we'll have more information, especially on this pandemic assistance revenue program. So stay tuned. Or if you want to learn more, contact your local Farm Service Agency office and they can walk you through what they know. Again, because it just came out yesterday, probably they're still waiting for some of the paperwork themselves. One thing that of note here in the state of Ohio, that USDA did designate Brown and Claremont counties as primary natural disaster areas. So the declaration was made for those counties for Brown and Claremont. So, and that is due to excessive rainfall that occurred from the beginning of May through the mid part of June. So again, it's primary counties were Brown and Claremont. However, the contiguous counties are also eligible in Ohio. You can see those on the list there. Adams, Clinton, Hamilton, Highland, and Warren counties. Of course, if we have any of our friends from Kentucky on today, there are some contiguous counties across the border that would also be eligible for this as well. So if you did have some type of disaster, there is this declaration that's out there for these emergency loans. So it could be replacing equipment or livestock, or maybe it's about doing some refinancing or reorganization. You can check in with your Farm Service Agency office. Again, you can see the application deadline is May 29th of 2023. So I have plenty of time on that program, but some of you might not have heard that there was a disaster declaration made for Brown and Claremont. Some other deadlines that we should be aware of that are forthcoming: county committee elections. Those ballots have been mailed out to producers. So just a reminder, as we move into December, which is going to be here before we know it, those ballots are due back. We already had Jason visit with us about the Dairy Margin Coverage Program, the DMC program, knowing the timeline is drawing near. And I thought Jason did an excellent job of showing what kind of levels that you might want to consider as far as your coverage if you're a dairy producer. Then we also mentioned last month about the second disaster set aside for farm loans can be taken up until December 31st. So again, as we move into December, this program, which is allowing those that have eligible USDA loans, that they can set aside that payment as long as you're not over 90 days past the deadline for that payment. So if you have a loan with the USDA, and there was already one program that allowed for initial postponement of a payment, so here's the second iteration of that. And then finally, we'll be talking about the Agricultural Risk Coverage, ARC, and Price Loss Coverage Program. Of course, we're in a lame duck session now, but we know as we turn the page to next year, where there's going to be a lot more discussions about the farm bill, the new farm bill coming, but also we'll be giving our projections as far as our thoughts and assessment on the ARC and the PLC program, as far as what options should be chosen for the new year. Of course, we have until March 15th of 2023, so we'll be talking about those in future farm office lives as well. An important deadline, and this deadline is really close. It will be at the beginning of next week. The need to apply for the coverage by November 20th to be eligible for 2023 NAP coverage. So these are on our crops such as apples and asparagus, cherries, chestnuts, forages, the hay and pasture where producers might be buying NAP coverage. The grape producers up in Northeast Ohio, I know, buy some NAP coverage. And then some of your other fruits, like peaches and pears and strawberries, but also honey and maple syrup. Just know that those, to be eligible, those policies, that coverage needs to be purchased here in the next few days. If you're looking for more information on the NAP program, the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, the FSA has a really nice fact sheet, and you can see the link there. And I will hopefully grab that and drop that in the chat box here. And then just one thing that we've been talking about, we talked about last night. Looks like that this year will be a pretty healthy for most of our farms. And we're sensing maybe that, of course, is going to change in 2023. But there may be some farms that have higher income tax obligations for this year, may have higher gross receipts that have come in. So what can we do going forward? and this was a big part of what our discussion was for 2 hours last night in the farm and farmland tax webinar, but I thought I'd just give a quick screenshot as far as, excess income, maybe deferring some sales, and especially if you have storage to be able to do that, to defer sales into the new year, banking on that there might be a little less income in 2023. Also deferring the constructive receipt of payments from people that owe you money. Of course, for farmers, we're pretty used to the prepaying expenses, knowing that there are limitations to that. And the one thing that we mentioned last night is those prepay expenses are usually limited to 50% of all of our expenses. So when we're purchasing those supplies for next year, we need to make sure that those are not deposits. If there was an audit that was triggered and it's a deposit, for instance, you would say, I'm just putting the deposit down for fertilizer, but there's no set quantity, no set price, and that there's a chance for your deposit to be returned if you don't purchase or use it all. Well, that's a deposit, and that can't be used as a prepaid expense. So if you have questions about that, talk, of course, to your tax professional about that. Income averaging is one of the most underutilized manners for farmers to save money. It is an advantage that we have as Schedule F filers, knowing that you can go back and income average or use up tax brackets from the 3 previous years. So for here in 2022, we would go back 3 years, looking to see maybe we could use, if we're in a higher tax bracket this year, well, maybe we could take some of that income and push it back, and that's distributed evenly between the previous 3 years. But is there a way to go use up space in an unused lower tax bracket for income that we have received this year? And sometimes our tax folks, if for farmers, they may not go through this, and some do, depending on their computer program. But it's one of those things in a higher income year, there is some advantage to using some income averaging to lower your tax obligation this year because you're using up future or past tax brackets. So might be something you put in your toolbox to talk to your tax professional about. Again, and we're always thinking about retirement plan contributions. When we want to retire, there was a nice increase on Social Security with the COLA as we're going forward in 2023. But now's the time to think about doing some retirement plans, especially for those younger members in our operation. And just as a reminder, most farmers know that to buy equipment, accelerate the depreciation. Of course, again, you have to be able to have that constructive receipt that equipment that you're buying is on site, ready to be placed into service before you can depreciate it. But know the Section 179 for accelerating depreciation is just over $1 million before you start to have phase outs that incur. And then the bonus depreciation is still at 100% for this year, knowing that it's on its phase out. So its phase out starts next year, it drops to 80%, and then we'll step down from there. However, there has been some talk out there about lame duck session changes to bonus depreciation. So there's been some talk, where that talk goes or not, that maybe this bonus depreciation will stay 100%. A rumor I heard it was stay 100% for the next 5 years and then phase out completely. We know bonus depreciation has been one of those things that has been kind of sitting there with the idea that it's going to be sunset. So what will happen in lame duck sessions? We'll be watching. Hopefully on our December Farm Office Live, we might have some of those, and maybe nothing happens from a lame duck session, but just some things to think about. Of course, if you know that you have higher income, we've had some really nice commodity prices here. If you know you have higher income now, not December, now is the time to go talk to your tax professional to help you out there. And then we have a guide for underserved farmers and ranchers, mentioned this other time last month as well. And it's an excellent for underserved farmers, whether that's female producers, minority producers, underserved producers, like maybe some military veterans. There's a wonderful new guide on farmers.gov that is a guide for underserved farmers and ranchers. And I do see a Q&A there on where on our website can I get a copy of the slide deck. It's at farmoffice.osu.edu/farm office live. there's a link right up on the top that maybe one of my cohorts can grab that link and direct link to send it to you, but those where those slides are. Okay, with that, we are right to our finish. Our next webinar is going to be December 16th next month from 10 to 11:30 a.m. As always, we really appreciate you being on here, and we would invite you to complete today's evaluation. And that evaluation can be found in the chat box. Just hit the link there in the chat box. You can go to it. Also, as you exit today's program, as your browser closes, it should take you to another browser where you can do just a quick survey. What we're particularly interested in is hearing your observations on topics that you would like to hear of for future programs, whether that be in December as we move into January. And thank you, Peggy, for putting the slides up there. She put the hot link right there. So with that, are there any other questions, Peggy or Robert, or observations you want to make before we close today's program?
Nothing in the Q&A, David.
Okay, beautiful. And you got the slides. So again, as always, it's a pleasure to join us together, to be together and to do the Farm Office Live. And we hope that we see you there on December 16th as well. So have a great Thanksgiving, everyone. We appreciate it.
Bye.